Hey everybody, welcome back. With this video, we are beginning our reading and discussion of Simone Weil. She is a um, French thinker writing in the 1930s and 40s. She is really interesting, and she's very difficult to sort of locate within a, usual category or movement in philosophy, very idiosyncratic, as it were. Um, she is a contemporary of people like Sartre and de Beauvoir and Camus. Um, she is influenced by Greek philosophy, by radical social philosophy, by Christianity and mysticism. She is just a really unique and original thinker and has some really powerful things to say. And I think that having just done Nietzsche, and Nietzsche sort of, I want to say turning philosophy on its head, but only in as much as if we take the history of philosophy to be something that's following in the wake of Plato and Aristotle, and a sense of virtue that is one of the main driving forces behind philosophy. And Nietzsche was someone who seemed to be retreating back to you know the Thrasymachus of the Republic, of the pre-Socratic philosophers. That there is a sort of sense of intuition and creativity, but also a sense of challenging, just like say Socrates does, societal norms, mores, ethics, and all that stuff. But at the same time, the traditional aims of philosophy itself to attain some sort of like universal truth or objective knowledge. And Nietzsche comes along and just sort of dismantles that. And you kind of see that theme in the thinkers that we've looked at. It's just Nietzsche does it in such a powerful, provocative way that it's one of the reasons that he's so well known. He just doesn't really pull his punches. Um, and I sort of go over that a little bit to say that Simone Weil follows Nietzsche, nicely, in as much as we kind of come upon a critique, especially in the work that we're reading of hers, the Iliad, or the Poem of Force, in which we see a history of the world that seems to sort of support a lot of the things that Nietzsche said. But for her, she wants to try to find some sort of way of addressing it, not of embracing it as something to be celebrated, but of something from which we might escape, if only temporarily. Uh, she she presents something that I think that her analysis. I'll just say this: her analysis is difficult to argue with. I think that an honest appraisal of human history and conflict and interpersonal relationships, and our standing and affiliation with institutions, and our ideological stances, that they bring us into these conflicting relationships. They bring us into conflict, and we find that we are often sort of ordered about and moved about by powers that that we're not really in control of. And as we go through the text, we'll sort of see how she demonstrates this. And this text is her rereading Homer's Iliad, and she translates passages from the Greek, and is sort of offering a commentary or a reading and an interpretation of it. It basically says that this is probably the finest, most beautiful, terrible, honest picture of the human condition, and we find it echoed in a couple of other, great works. But for the most part, this is sort of the first best picture of human life. And you know, so on one hand, we have this really cutting, um, fairly genius analysis that we want to try to understand. And then, as I mentioned before, she's trying to offer us a way to deal with it, like honestly, not some sort of utopic idea that we're somehow going to evolve past this. At least we don't get that in this work. So we don't just want to embrace it on one hand and just be like, oh, well, this is the, we're always going to be, subordinated force, which we are, right? But she's not simply resigned to that she wants to cultivate, perhaps, she's exhorting us to cultivate a manner of an understanding of virtue, right? She's getting from the Greeks, and also from Christianity. And she wants us to cultivate the ability to hesitate before we um, allow ourselves to be appropriated and used by um, force, by any sort of mechanism of power or violence or domination, anything like that. Because when we do that, and it doesn't matter what side of the equation that we're on, and we're gonna go through this a little bit and get some variations of this equation. It doesn't matter if you're the victim or if you're the one who's doing the victimizing, if you are the oppressor or the oppressed, that it is the sort of mechanism that apprehends both parties, and that it is really force itself that must be temporarily halted, and that can only happen by people who choose not to be appropriated by it. And it's not just that you can willy nilly be like, okay, well, it's not going to happen to me in this moment. That it's something that sort of requires certain sensibilities that I think need to be cultivated, and perhaps through um, habituated practices, sort of gives you a fighting chance. I'll also mention that um, she died really young. She was someone who was not physically healthy, and she threw herself into various situations during her young life to go and suffer with other people who were suffering or who were struggling. A really fascinating life. I mean, a tragic life, but if you ever get a chance and you're curious, you know, you can you can read about her a little bit more at the front of the anthology that we're using, or you can find some information online. I'm sure, no problem. But she came from a Jewish family, but she wasn't a practicing, in no way practiced this sort of um, religion. She um, and I mentioned that she was influenced by Christianity, and I don't believe she ever converted to Christianity. So she wasn't. She was perhaps um, sympathetic and moved by and embraced certain aspects of Christianity, but I don't think that it was some sort of official affiliation. She didn't get baptized or anything like that. And it seems as though she pretty much found the various aspects of philosophy and the intellectual history at her disposal, and sort of took that and synthesized it, as a lot of great thinkers do, into her own unique view of the world. Okay, so saying all that, let's go ahead and take a look at the text. And what I'm going to try to do is get through a few pages, and more than likely this will be just two videos to get at some of the key passages, to sort of get at what she's sort of arguing here. So let's start on page 163, and we'll just start with the beginning of the text. She writes, The true hero, the true subject, the center of the Iliad is force. Force employed by man, force that enslaves man, force before which man's flesh shrinks away. In this work, at all times, the human spirit is shown as modified by its relations with force, as swept away, blinded by the very force it imagined it could handle, as deformed by the weight of the force it submits to. For those dreamers who considered that force, thanks to progress, would soon be a thing of the past, the Iliad could appear as a historical document. For others whose powers of recognition are more acute and who perceive force today as yesterday, at the very center of human history, the Iliad is the purest and the loveliest of mirrors. Um, and so, if you're familiar with the Iliad, which we talked a little bit about Homer, when the course was beginning, um, the Iliad is the very famous epic poem um, that talks about the Trojan War, and it is the sort of, we assume that the main character is Achilles, right? And there's other really famous figures in there as well, Hector and Odysseus and Ajax, and, Menelaus and Agamemnon, and all those people. But what she's saying is the real hero, the figure that sort of really steps forward in terms of what it's all about is force, right? That she basically says here, as we mentioned earlier, employed by man or force that enslaves man, that it's not as simple as there is a person who has power or authority, or has the weapon in their hands, or has the the mechanism at their disposal, and that it is applied to, used against someone else, right? That it is everyone involved. And let's, for simplicity's sake, let's just take two people. That either person in that is under the sway of force. And she says, the human spirit is shown as modified by its relation with force, as swept away, blinded by the very force it imagined it can handle. That it has a way of grabbing hold of us and overcoming us. Like whatever we thought our desires were, whatever we thought we wanted, however good of a person we think we are, or don't, that we all end up under the sway of force. It overcomes us. And perhaps, we don't always recognize it. Like perhaps we only think of it in terms of really sort of exaggerated, moments, perhaps sort of through the lens of Hollywood or something. And that is, someone so overcome by madness or grief or, the desire for revenge, or just, someone with a lot of power who's just out to get everybody, whatever it is, right? But, it doesn't have to be so exaggerated, for this to be true, that this can sort of represent itself in a variety of ways. But it is perhaps the most explicit ways that make it clear for us. And that is going to be when one is overcome by the urge to, exercise force, power, violence over someone else. Again, physically, it's the most apparent, but it doesn't have to be physical. So let's talk a little bit more about what this is. Next paragraph, she says, to define force, it is that X, whatever that is, that turns anybody who is subject to it into a thing. Exercised to the limit, it turns a man into a thing. In the most literal sense, it makes a corpse out of him. Somebody was here, and the next minute, there is nobody here at all. This is a spectacle the Iliad never wearies of showing us. And then she cites some lines. The horses rattled the empty chariots through the files of battle, longing for their noble drivers, but they on the ground lay dearer to the vultures than to their wives. The hero becomes a thing, dragged behind a chariot in the dust. Another quote. All around his black hair was spread, in the dust his whole head lay. That once charming head now Zeus had let his enemies defile it on his native soil. The bitterness of such a spectacle, she writes, is offered us absolutely undiluted. No comforting fiction intervenes, no consoling prospect of immortality, and on the hero's head no washed out halo of patriotism descends. So, you can also think about this from from her own situation, think of it historically and what's going on in the 30s and 40s in Europe. Um, you know, um, she's French, so we know what happens in World War II. What's sort of what's building up and what's going to happen. Um, Now, saying that, she is here to get to her definition, and again, this is on page 163. To define force, it's that X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing. She takes humans to be more than just you know mere clever creatures. That to her, that there is something about the human soul or consciousness, whatever you'd like to call it, and that it is something special. It is something um, that that gives us access to a way of being and a way of knowing, that just being purely alive, just purely existing, that itself doesn't speak to it. And force, again, in the most literal, sense, in the extreme, this means like killing somebody. So someone who's alive is now dead. But it can also mean that they're just rendered a thing. They have become a controlled object of some sort. That it could also mean that we lose our basic humanity and simply become, mm, objectified. We become a thing, right? And this happens all the time. This happens, this happens when you try to talk to customer service. This happens, when you're assigned a number, right? And that your individual identity isn't particularly relevant or important in the things that you like and the things that you've done or not done, when you are merely just a thing. Now, this basically means that when this happens, whatever it is that makes us human on a sort of essential level is taken from us. And this is what she's saying, that the Iliad, this ancient text, this is what it discloses to us. And it does it, without apology. It doesn't do it in a way that says, well, it's okay, it's all right, like it's all part of like a plan, or hey, even if you suffer, it's okay because you're going to go to a better place or anything like that. None of that's in there. It's just the pure human situation as force takes control of people's lives. And this is tragic, and it's true, right? And as long as there is, we might want to say, as long as there's the prospect of power, of control, right? That force is always going to be the sort of true hero of the human epic. And hero not in the sense of like, something that we should aspire to, but more of just, the protagonist, right? The character or force or phenomenon around which everything circles. Um, let's see. Let's read it just a little bit more here. And she also mentions, and this is why I brought up, the sort of the historical context in which she herself is writing, because the last thing we looked at on page 164 is no comforting fiction intervenes, no consoling prospects of immortality, and on the hero's head no washed out halo of patriotism descends. In the sense that, like, that somehow any particular nationalistic patriotism somehow like makes the things that we do when it comes to violence somehow um, excusable or moral. Now it's the real world. I don't think that she's being, um, I don't think she's trying to. She's sort of embracing the reality, the history of the world, and the way that it has always worked. Um, but that the stories that we tell ourselves sometimes, individually or in groups or collectively in terms of a people, that these some sometimes oftentimes are stories that we tell ourselves to somehow offset or ameliorate or allow us to forget or misdirect um, the truth of the things that have happened or are happening, and try to see it as justified or that we are somehow in the right, and that it's not an adequate or honest understanding of force at play. Um, Now let's see here. Um, if you drop down, she says, still more poignant, still on page 164. So painful in the contrast is this contrast, is the sudden evocation as quickly rubbed out of another world, the faraway, precarious, touching world of peace, of the family, the world in which each man counts more than anything else to those about him. And then another passage. She ordered her bright-haired maids in the palace to place on the fire a large tripod preparing a hot bath for Hector. Returning from battle, foolish woman, already he lay far from hot baths, slain by grey-eyed Athena who guided Achilles on. Far from hot baths he was indeed, poor man, and not he alone, she writes. Nearly all the Iliad takes place far from hot baths. Nearly all of human life, then and now, takes place far from hot baths. I mean, if you're wondering what all that's about, if it's not resonating with you, I mean, the things that signify family, comfort, security, being at ease, like the dimension of peace that that makes up parts of our lives, but not the totality of our lives. And it's something like the amazingly curative powers of like a good hot bath, a good hot shower, whatever. That much of what goes on in the Iliad, of course, is on the battlefield and in the camps, right? And this isn't it's not where there's peace and comfort, right? That there's this sense that what we're always trying to get home to, what we're always trying to get back to, um, is is that which is vital, but it's such a small part um, of what actually comprises our life, um, and that is our our participation in a world of force, how we are used and how we use or think that we use the various. Even if we want to think these in terms of Nietzschean powers, right? That we think that we are exercising um, our good judgment or our we have insight into what it is that we're trying to bring about through the way that we talk about things or the projects that we're pursuing. Um, but that these may not be the things that take us back to those moments of ease that perhaps a lot of the stuff that we do, a lot of the stuff that we pursue, strands us in the battlefield of life, as it were, in which we can't really extricate ourselves from that because of again the things that we believe or the types of projects that we undertake, how we're choosing to spend our time, what it is that we are choosing to value. In any case, she writes, here we set force in its grossest and most summary form, the force that kills. How much more varied in its processes, how much more surprising in its affects is the other force, the force that does not kill, the force that is not killed just yet. It surely, it will surely kill. It will possibly kill, or perhaps it merely hangs poised and ready over the head of the creature it can kill at any moment, which is to say at every moment. In whatever aspect its effect is the same, it turns a man into a stone. From its first property, the ability to turn a human being into a thing by the simple method of killing him, flows another quite prodigious too, in its own way, the ability to turn a human being into a thing while he is still alive. He is alive, he has a soul, and yet he is a thing. And this, she says, is extraordinary, right? To have a soul, right? And that's what we human beings possess. But that's what it is that can be taken from us by force. And and I'm trying to present it in ways you can really get your head around her analysis, which is, it's not just that this person or this system or this institution or whatever, that they are the ones that come and take it from you. That it's more encompassing, and it's you and them in this sort of dynamic, and that not only are you rendered a thing um, in that dynamic, but so is the one who is the sort of enactor or the aggressor, right? The one that's forcing you to be something other than what it is that you could be or should be, right? The sort of living expression of a soul and the virtues of a soul, something like that. Um, let's just look at one more thing real quickly. So if you go to page 167, and again, the degree to which you know the Iliad, I think the better you're going to catch a lot of this stuff. But even if you don't know it, it's fine, because she sort of outlines everything that's going on, so you should be able to follow. But at the top of page 167, she writes, "But this feeling lasts only a moment, right?" And so her solution, if you even want to call it that, is just something that's momentary. It's not. It's just um, it's just a lingering moment of escape from force. It's not as though we can come up with a political system that's going to like fix everything and stop all force, and it's not as though we can adopt a philosophy that somehow extricates us um, from having to be involved in society or in the world, right? But in our moment to moment lives, whenever we are in an encounter in which we might get caught up in the most sort of explicit of ways, again, whether that's violence and death or if that's some other form of manipulation or domination, that we have some sort of like we don't become these reactionary, you know, bringing the force, violence, dominating, manipulative counterpoint, in which we're just trying to reciprocate, but we somehow decide to not respond in that way, right? But in some other way, or not at all. In any case, she says, "But this feeling lasts only a moment. Soon the very presence of the suffering creature is forgotten." Another citation. "He spoke, the other remembering his own father, um, longing." He said, "Longed to weep. Taking the old man's arm, he pushed him away. Both were remembering. Thinking of Hector, killer of men, Priam wept, abased at the feet of Achilles. But Achilles wept now for his father, now for Patroclus. And their sobs resounded through the house." So, if you remember, Achilles kills Hector, um, but he wasn't going to let Hector, be buried, which was very important to the Greeks. I mean, it's still important to us now. Um, and so Priam, his father, the king of Troy, he he sneaks into the camp and makes his ways to Achilles' tent, and he basically begs him for his son's body so that he could give him a proper burial. And this little scene here is how they were able to sort of be humans, and Achilles is going to yield, right? as angry as he was because of the death of Patroclus, right? Then he went out and he killed Hector. And he's this is what I'm going to do to the body, and da 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 da. But but that there's still some noble possibility that exists in him, who and he's perhaps the chief embodiment of force in Homer's Iliad. He is the killer of men. Um, but even he, that there's some sense of humanity or virtue that can be elicited, and Priam does that. And he says it was not insensibility that made Achilles, with a single movement of his hand, push away the old man who had been clinging to his knees. Priam's words, recalling his own old father, had moved him to tears. It was merely a question of his being as free in his attitudes and movements as if clasping his knees were not a suppliant, but an inert object. Anybody who is in our vicinity exercises a certain power over us by his very presence, and a power that belongs to him alone, that is, the power of halting, repressing, modifying each movement that our body sketches out. She in a few pages she refers to this. She articulated a few different ways. The interval of hesitation, pausing. That anytime somebody is physically present, that the equation of force, or a power dynamic, if you will, is at work. And we make demands upon each other just by being physically present. But there has to be a way, or there should be a way, in which we can not succumb to what it is that force desires, which is the execution of it. That is the enactment of it in some way, in which that power dynamic, that realization of force manifests, right? That it steps forward, and it's not just sort of there in any sort of latent sense, but it becomes overt. And then we are, rendered subject, thing, object, something like that. I'll pause here for now. Hopefully you're getting a sense of what's going on here and what's at stake. But we'll come back, we'll do another video, and we'll hit on some more sort of interesting passages to flesh this out, and then also this idea of hesitation and pausing and perhaps escaping force. So until then, keep reading, keep thinking. I'll see you soon.